The boardroom on the 41st floor had seen 1,000 ordinary mornings. And this one began exactly like the rest, with coffee cooling in porcelain cups and quiet voices discussing numbers that meant nothing to the man kneeling beside an electrical panel 2 floors below. Victoria Hayes walked the marble corridor the way she always did. Spine straight, heels striking the floor in a rhythm that sounded like control itself, a woman who had built an empire out of code and conviction, and had never once let anyone see her flinch. She passed the maintenance cart without slowing, the same cart she had passed every week for the better part of a year, and the man beside it barely registered as anything more than a gray uniform and a scuffed toolbox. Then, without warning, without breaking her stride, her hand found his wrist and closed around it. And for one suspended second, the entire hallway seemed to hold its breath. She did not look at him. She did not raise her voice. She only leaned close enough that her words reached no ear but his. 2 words wrapped in something that sounded almost like shame at having to say them at all. "Help me." In that instant, something shifted behind Ethan Carter's eyes, a stillness that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition, the particular recognition of a man who had heard those exact words in that exact tone before, in places far from marble floors and glass towers, in moments when a whisper was the only kind of scream a person had left. He did not ask why. He did not reach for a phone. He simply straightened, let his gaze move once across the corridor behind her, cataloging faces the way he used to catalog exits, and understood with a certainty that settled into his chest like cold water that somewhere in this gleaming building, a hunt had already begun. Ethan Carter had learned, a long time ago, that the most dangerous men in any room were rarely the ones who looked dangerous. He had learned it in deserts and embassies and the backs of armored vehicles, long before he traded that life for a set of keys to a Seattle office tower and a job title that made people's eyes glaze over the moment he said it out loud. Building maintenance manager. Nobody asked follow-up questions about building maintenance managers. Nobody wondered what his hands had done before they learned to rewire a breaker panel or patch a leaking pipe. And that suited him fine, because the man he used to be had cost him more than most people ever knew. Every morning he arrived before the sun cleared the skyline, walked the stairwells before the elevators woke up, checked the cameras out of habit rather than duty, and kept his head down among executives who never learned his first name. He liked it that way. Invisibility, he had come to understand, was its own kind of peace. Victoria Hayes did not have the luxury of invisibility. And she had stopped wanting it years earlier, the day she took over Hayes Dynamics from a board that expected her to fail within a year, and instead watched her turn a struggling technology firm into one of the most valuable companies on the West Coast. She was 36 years old, sharp enough to silence a room with a single sentence, and lonely in the particular way that only certain and successful people understand, surrounded by allies whose loyalty had a price tag stitched somewhere into the lining. On this particular morning, she was 48 hours from finalizing a merger worth just over $2 billion. A deal that would either cement her legacy or, depending on who you asked inside the company, quietly end it. Reporters camped outside the lobby for comment. Analysts speculated about her every public appearance. And somewhere inside her own organization, the temperature had changed in a way she could feel but could not yet name. A coldness moving through hallways that used to feel like home. Damian Cross, the company's chief financial officer, had grown louder in recent weeks, pushing meetings earlier, pushing signatures faster, pushing Victoria toward decisions before she had time to question them. He smiled at every board meeting with the practiced warmth of a man who had learned exactly how much charm a room could absorb before it curdled into suspicion. Olivia Brooks, Victoria's assistant, noticed things too. Small things, calendars that changed without explanation, meetings that vanished from the system only to reappear under different names. Marcus Reed, the company's director of security, insisted everything was under control, that the recent uptick in threats against Victoria was standard for a woman of her profile, nothing worth losing sleep over. Victoria wanted to believe him. She had built her entire career on trusting numbers over feelings. and yet the feeling in her stomach that week refused to be reasoned away, no matter how many spreadsheets she buried it under. It was on her way to a private strategy session, walking a corridor she had walked 10,000 times before, that the feeling finally found a shape she could not ignore. She caught sight of two men near the elevator bank wearing suits slightly too formal for a Tuesday morning, their eyes moving with a discipline that had nothing to do with corporate curiosity. She caught the flicker of something metallic near a laptop bag that should have held nothing but paperwork. And in that fractured half-second, walking past a man in a gray uniform, whose face she had seen 100 times without ever truly looking at it, instinct overrode every careful, practiced habit she had spent years perfecting. Her hand found his wrist. Her voice found two words. And though she did not understand why, some quiet part of her believed, with an intensity she could not explain, that the man beside the electrical panel was the only person in the building who might actually be able to save her. Ethan did not move immediately. He let 3 seconds pass, 3 seconds that felt to Victoria like an entire winter, and in those seconds he ran through a set of calculations that had once been second nature and had since gone dormant, buried under years of ordinary life. He noted the direction Victoria's eyes had darted before she reached him. He noted the pace of her breathing. Controlled, but shallow, the breathing of someone trained to appear calm in front of cameras and boardrooms, but not trained for genuine fear. He noted, most importantly, that her whisper had not been a plea for comfort. It had been a request for extraction, delivered by someone who somewhere deep down still remembered what real danger felt like, even if she had never been taught the vocabulary for it. Something in Ethan Carter, something he had spent 6 years trying to bury under drywall dust and fluorescent lighting, opened its eyes for the first time since he had walked away from his old life. He did not know yet who was hunting Victoria Hayes, but he knew, with the certainty of a man who had once made a career of knowing such things, that whoever it was had made a very serious mistake underestimating the building's maintenance manager. For the rest of that morning, Ethan did nothing that would draw attention. He finished his rounds. He replaced a flickering light on the 17th floor. He said good morning to the receptionist the same way he always did. His voice even, his hands steady, betraying nothing of the machinery now turning behind his calm expression, but his eyes had changed their function entirely. Where they once passed over hallways looking for burned-out bulbs and jammed doors, they now measured distances between exits, counted security personnel, tracked which employees lingered too long near executive floors without obvious reason. He noticed 2 men near the east stairwell, wearing earpieces disguised poorly as hands-free phone devices. Their posture too rigid for casual employees, their eyes tracking Victoria's movements on the floor above through the glass. He noticed a 3rd man standing near the parking garage entrance, whose right hand never left the pocket of his jacket. Not once in the 20 minutes, Ethan observed him from a maintenance closet with a sight line through a service window. And when he checked the security feed for floor 32, the floor housing the executive suites, he found the camera there had gone dark exactly 11 minutes before Victoria had grabbed his wrist in the hallway. 11 minutes. Ethan turned that number over in his mind the way he used to turn over intelligence reports before a deployment, searching for the story hidden inside the timing. Someone had disabled that camera deliberately, and they had done it with enough advance planning to suggest this was not an improvised threat but a coordinated operation, the kind that required reconnaissance, access, and patience. Whoever was behind it understood the building's layout well enough to know exactly which blind spot to exploit, which meant the threat almost certainly originated from inside the company rather than outside it. Ethan had seen this pattern before, years earlier, halfway across the world, protecting men and women whose enemies wore the same uniforms they did. He had learned then that the most effective attacks rarely came through the front door. They came from someone already holding a key. Ethan understood better than most that surveillance rarely announced itself, that the men who intended real harm were trained to look like furniture, like background noise, like the kind of people whose faces you forgot the moment they left a room. He had spent years learning to read the smallest signals a body gave off under stress or intention. The way a shoulder squared itself half a second before a hand moved, the way eyes tracked a target's rhythm rather than a room's general activity, the way trained men breathed differently from nervous ones. Watching the two men near the east stairwell, he counted the seconds between their glances toward the executive floor, noted the discipline in their stillness, and recognized in it the unmistakable signature of professionals rather than opportunists. Amateurs fidgeted. Amateurs checked their phones or shifted their weight or looked around too often, betraying nerves they could not fully control. These men did none of that, and their patience told Ethan more about the scale of the threat than any single piece of evidence could have on its own, because patience like that required funding, planning, and a level of confidence that came only from believing the outcome was already decided. He spent the remainder of the afternoon rewriting Victoria's schedule without her knowledge, using access privileges nobody had bothered to revoke from his early days, consulting on the building's security infrastructure, a detail buried so deep in his employment file that even Marcus Reed had forgotten it existed. He shifted a private meeting from a conference room with a single exit to one with two, moved a scheduled elevator ride to a stairwell under the excuse of routine inspection, and quietly flagged the disabled camera for repair under a work order that would not reach anyone's desk until the following week. He told no one what he suspected. He alerted no authorities, called no old contacts, made no dramatic gestures that might tip off whoever was watching. He simply became, once again, the kind of man who moved through danger without announcing his presence, a shadow standing between a woman who did not yet understand the size of the threat against her and the people who intended to make sure she never understood it at all. The signing ceremony for the merger took place 2 days later on the top floor, in a glass-walled room designed to impress investors and photograph beautifully for the business press. Victoria stood at the head of a long table, flanked by lawyers and board members, delivering the kind of composed remarks that had made her famous in industry circles. When the first sign of trouble arrived without warning or explanation, the elevators lost power simultaneously, all 6 of them freezing between floors. Stranding employees in metal boxes, lit only by dim emergency lighting. Seconds later, the stairwell doors on the executive level locked automatically. A fail-safe meant for fire emergencies now weaponized against the very people it was designed to protect. Then, the fire alarm began screaming through the building, sending panicked employees scrambling toward exits that either would not open or led nowhere useful, chaos spreading through the floor with the particular speed of confusion mistaken for danger and danger mistaken for confusion. In the middle of that chaos, a man Victoria had never seen before moved toward her with the calm, unhurried purpose of someone who had rehearsed every step. He wore a security badge that looked convincing enough to pass a glance, moved through the panicking crowd like water, finding the path of least resistance, and closed the distance between himself and Victoria with a precision that had nothing to do with helping anyone evacuate. His hand slid toward his jacket exactly the way the man in the parking garage had held his hand 2 days earlier, and for a fraction of a second Victoria understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to help her, that the danger she had sensed in the hallway had finally found its moment. Ethan appeared from a service corridor before the man's hand ever cleared his jacket. He moved without wasted motion, closing 8 feet of distance in under 2 seconds, and executed exactly 3 movements that ended the confrontation before most of the room even registered it had begun. A deflection that redirected the concealed weapon toward the floor. A strike to the side of the man's neck that folded his knees without a sound loud enough to carry over the fire alarm. A controlled takedown that left the intruder unconscious against the base of a conference table, restrained with a zip tie Ethan had been carrying in his tool belt for exactly this kind of unlikely necessity. The entire sequence took less than 4 seconds. Nobody in the panicked crowd understood what had happened except Victoria, who stood frozen a few feet away, staring at the man in the gray uniform as though seeing him for the first time in her life. He did not explain himself. He simply looked at her, checked once over his shoulder for additional threats, and spoke in a voice so quiet it barely carried over the alarm still wailing through the building. "Stay behind me." Victoria did exactly that, something inside her recognizing, without needing further proof, that whatever this man had once been, he was the only person in the entire building she could trust completely in that moment. When security finally arrived and the fire alarm cut off, when the elevators hummed back to life and the stairwell doors released with an audible click, nobody could explain how the intruder had been subdued so cleanly, and nobody thought to question the maintenance manager standing quietly near the wall, already reaching for a radio to report a minor electrical malfunction as the official cause of the chaos. That evening, long after the building had emptied and the merger paperwork sat forgotten on a conference table, Victoria found Ethan in the basement level, coiling cable with the unhurried focus of a man trying very hard to disappear back into ordinary life. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking, studying him the way she studied balance sheets, searching for the story hidden underneath the numbers. "Who were you?" she finally asked. "Before all this." Ethan did not look up right away. "I retired," he said. Which was true, and also nothing close to a real answer. Victoria was not the kind of woman who accepted incomplete answers, not after watching a man dismantle an armed attacker in under 4 seconds without breaking a sweat, and she told him so plainly, without the polished diplomacy she usually reserved for boardrooms. She told him about the threats that had arrived over the past 3 months, first as vague, anonymous messages, then as something more specific, references to her father's old business dealings, references to people who no longer worked at the company and had not been heard from since their sudden, unexplained departures. She told him about the accounts that had been accessed without authorization. Financial records altered in ways too subtle for anyone but her to notice, board members who used to return her calls within the hour now taking days to respond. She told him she no longer knew who inside her own organization she could trust, and that until this afternoon, she had assumed the answer was simply nobody. Ethan listened without interrupting, the old habit of gathering complete information before acting settling back over him like a coat he had never quite outgrown. When she finished, he set down the cable in his hands and looked at her directly for the first time since she had walked in. "I'll help you," he said finally, "but only if you agree to one condition. From this moment forward, you listen to me, without argument, without hesitation, especially when what I ask makes no sense to you." Victoria studied him for a long moment, weighing the request against every instinct that had made her successful. The instinct to control every variable, to trust her own judgment above anyone else's. Then she nodded, because some deeper instinct, the one that had guided her hand to his wrist 2 days earlier, told her this was not a moment for pride. It was a moment for survival. Over the following days, Ethan moved through the company with a discretion that would have impressed his former commanders, gathering information the way he used to gather intelligence before an operation, patient and methodical, and utterly invisible to anyone not looking for him. He reviewed employee access logs that Marcus Reed claimed did not exist, only to find them buried in an outdated server nobody had thought to secure properly. He noticed personnel files that had been quietly edited in the weeks before the merger negotiations began. Dates altered, references removed. A pattern too deliberate to be clerical error. He tracked down 3 former employees whose departures had been described internally as voluntary resignations, only to discover, through careful and untraceable inquiries, that all 3 had left under circumstances involving threats they had been too frightened to report. He discovered that at least 2 members of Victoria's private security detail had received unexplained payments routed through shell accounts that led, eventually, and with considerable effort, back toward Damian Cross. Marcus Reed, meanwhile, grew increasingly evasive whenever Ethan asked routine questions about building access logs, offering explanations that contradicted themselves in small but telling ways. Olivia Brooks, without fully understanding the significance of what she was sharing, mentioned in passing that Damian had asked her twice in the past month to reschedule Victoria's calendar around meetings that never appeared on any official record. Piece by piece, a picture began forming. One that suggested the threat against Victoria Hayes did not come from some external rival or disgruntled outsider, but from someone who had spent years sitting across the table from her, smiling, nodding, pretending loyalty, while quietly building the machinery of her downfall. The deeper Ethan dug, the more he came to appreciate just how carefully the entire operation had been constructed, layered in a way that suggested whoever designed it understood corporate structures as intimately as Ethan understood tactical ones. Money moved through consulting fees that existed only on paper, routed through a firm registered in a state chosen specifically because its disclosure laws made tracing ownership nearly impossible for anyone without specialized resources. Communications between the conspirators never used company email or company phones, relying instead on prepaid devices purchased in cash from 3 different stores across 2 different counties, a level of caution that told Ethan this was not the work of a single impulsive man, but of someone who had studied exactly how these things typically unraveled and had taken deliberate steps to avoid every common mistake. Even the timing had been chosen with care, the merger negotiations providing both a motive plausible enough to survive scrutiny and a level of chaos substantial enough to hide smaller irregularities inside a much larger and more visible storm. Ethan found himself almost admiring the precision of it, the way a soldier might admire a well-executed maneuver from an enemy force, before reminding himself that admiration had no place in what he was about to do next. Victoria took the news the way she took most difficult news, with a controlled stillness that masked how deeply it had shaken her. She had known Damien for nearly a decade, had trusted him with decisions that shaped the entire company, had defended him publicly on more than one occasion when board members questioned his aggressive tactics. Learning that his ambition had curdled into something far darker than office politics forced her to reconsider every conversation they had shared in recent months. Every piece of advice he had offered that now looked, in hindsight, less like guidance and more like manipulation. She stopped attending meetings without Ethan somewhere nearby. She stopped trusting her own security detail entirely, relying instead on a man whose full history she still did not know. Because that man had proven, in the span of a single terrifying afternoon, that he was the only person left in her orbit who had never once lied to her. It was Victoria, searching through old employment records out of a curiosity she could no longer suppress, who finally uncovered the truth about who Ethan Carter had been before he became a man who fixed broken light fixtures for a living. Buried under years of redactions and classified file numbers was a record of a man who had once led a specialized team responsible for protecting foreign dignitaries and high-value targets in some of the most dangerous regions on Earth, a man credited, in language stripped of most identifying detail, with the successful extraction of dozens of hostages across multiple operations. And then, abruptly, the record simply stopped, replaced by a gap of several months and a single line indicating honorable discharge under circumstances the file did not explain. When she asked him about it directly, sitting across from him in the quiet of the building's empty security office late one night, Ethan did not deflect the way he had before. He told her, in a voice stripped of its usual composure, about a mission that had gone wrong in ways no amount of training could have prevented, about a decision he had made in a fraction of a second that saved most of the people under his protection but not all of them, about the particular weight of losing someone under your watch, a weight that never fully lifts, no matter how many years pass, or how ordinary a life you try to build on top of it. He told her he had left not because he stopped believing in the work, but because he stopped believing he deserved to keep doing it. Victoria listened without offering easy comfort, understanding instinctively that this was not a wound that wanted platitudes. She understood something else too, something that settled quietly into place as she watched him speak, that Ethan Carter had not truly retired from who he was. He had simply been waiting, without realizing it, for a reason good enough to become that man again. The conspiracy Ethan eventually uncovered ran deeper and older than either of them had first suspected, reaching back nearly 2 decades to a business dispute involving Victoria's late father, a dispute that had quietly ruined another family while building the foundation of the Hayes fortune. Damien Cross, it turned out, was not simply an ambitious executive chasing a bigger title. He was the son of the man Victoria's father had destroyed. A man who lost his company, his reputation, and eventually his life to a slow unraveling that began the day Victoria's father outmaneuvered him in a hostile business deal decades earlier. Damien had spent years rebuilding himself under a different professional identity, working his way patiently into Hayes dynamics with a single purpose hidden beneath his charm and his competence, a purpose that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a debt he believed only Victoria's downfall could settle. His plan, once fully revealed, proved more elaborate than a simple hostile takeover. He had spent months manipulating the merger negotiations to weaken the company's standing, just enough to make Victoria appear reckless to the board, feeding selective information to outside investors, quietly recruiting allies among shareholders eager for change. The staged attack during the signing ceremony had never been intended to kill her outright. Ethan realized as the pieces came together, but rather to stage a dramatic kidnapping that would force her into a position where resignation seemed like the only reasonable path forward, all while Damien positioned himself as the steady hand who could save the company from further chaos. It was theater. Elaborately constructed and brutally cold. Designed to look like circumstance while every element had been engineered from the very beginning. Ethan did not confront Damien immediately. Instead, drawing on instincts sharpened across a career built on patience, he constructed a counter-operation of his own, feeding carefully falsified information through channels he knew Damien's allies were monitoring, creating the appearance of vulnerability where none actually existed. He arranged for Victoria's schedule to suggest a private, unguarded meeting at a location that seemed on the surface dangerously exposed, while in reality every entrance and exit had been quietly secured under his direction. Cameras repositioned, exits monitored. Allies placed in positions Damien's people would never think to check. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, the hunters were about to discover they had become the hunted. The confrontation arrived on a night when the entire building had emptied, except for a skeleton crew of security personnel, most of them, Ethan now knew, compromised in one way or another. A coordinated power failure swept through the lower floors, plunging hallways into a darkness broken only by the dim red glow of emergency lighting. And Victoria found herself, exactly as the trap had been designed to suggest, alone and unguarded near the building's technical floor. Damien arrived, flanked by two men Ethan recognized from the earlier surveillance, their confidence obvious in the unhurried way they moved, certain this was the night everything finally fell into place. Marcus Reed arrived last, and the look on his face when he saw Victoria confirmed what Ethan had already suspected for days, that the head of security had been compromised from the very beginning. His silence purchased long before the first threat ever reached Victoria's inbox. What followed unfolded in near-total darkness, a confrontation built not on gunfire or spectacle but on the quiet, brutal efficiency of a man who had spent years training for exactly this kind of encounter. Ethan used the darkness itself as a weapon, understanding the building's layout with an intimacy none of his opponents could match, disabling one attacker near the ventilation shafts before the man even registered another presence in the room. He used the narrow corridors to negate the numerical disadvantage he faced, forcing confrontations one at a time, rather than allowing his opponents to surround him, drawing on tactics designed for exactly this kind of close quarters, high-stakes engagement. Marcus, when he finally moved against Ethan directly, discovered too late that years behind a desk had dulled instincts that had never been particularly sharp to begin with, and the fight ended almost as quickly as it began, leaving him restrained and stripped of whatever illusion of control he believed he still held. Throughout the confrontation, Victoria stayed exactly where Ethan had positioned her earlier that day, pressed against the reinforced wall near the server racks, close enough to observe everything and far enough to remain out of reach of anyone who might try to use her as leverage. She had expected, if she was honest with herself, to feel paralyzed by fear in a moment like this, the kind of fear that had kept her awake through countless nights over the past weeks. Instead, what she felt was something closer to clarity. Watching a man she had trusted with her life move through darkness and danger, with a competence that made the chaos around her feel almost distant, almost survivable. She understood, watching him, that this was not violence for its own sake, not the reckless brutality she had always associated with danger in the abstract, but something closer to discipline, a skill honed over years, and deployed now with a restraint that took more control than force ever could. It occurred to her, in the strange stillness between one confrontation and the next, that she had spent her entire professional life surrounded by people who mistook aggression for strength, and that the quietest man in the building had just shown her what real strength actually looked like. Damien, cornered at last in the flickering red emergency light, dropped the mask of corporate composure he had worn for years, and what emerged from underneath it was raw and unguarded in a way Victoria had never witnessed from him before. He told her everything, the words spilling out with the particular venom of a grievance nursed for decades, about his father's ruin, about years spent in poverty watching his family's name become a punchline in industry circles, about rebuilding himself for the sole purpose of standing in this exact moment. Watching everything Victoria's family had built collapse in front of the entire board. He had never wanted the company, he told her, his voice cracking with something closer to grief than triumph. He had only ever wanted her to understand, completely and finally, exactly what her father had taken from people who never deserved to lose it. Victoria, for the first time since this ordeal had begun, did not respond with the composed detachment she usually reserved for crisis, but with something rawer and more honest, an acknowledgement that her father's legacy had never been as clean as the company's official history suggested, that ambition unchecked by conscience had cost people things that money could never repay. But she refused to let that acknowledgement become an excuse for what Damien had done, refused to let old wounds justify new violence, and told him plainly that revenge built on someone else's suffering had never once, in the history of the world, healed the original wound it claimed to address. It was Ethan, standing quietly nearby with evidence he had spent days assembling, financial records and falsified documents, and recorded conversations, who delivered the final blow to Damien's carefully constructed plan, evidence detailed and damning enough that even Damien's own legal counsel would struggle to defend him. For a long moment after Damien finished speaking, nobody in that dim, red-lit room moved, the weight of 2 decades of buried resentment settling over the space like smoke that had nowhere left to go. Victoria found herself, unexpectedly, thinking not of the danger she had just survived, but of her father, a man she had spent her entire adult life trying to honor, without ever fully examining the cost of the empire he left behind. She had built her career believing that success excused almost anything, that the numbers on a balance sheet told the only story that mattered, and standing there in the wreckage of Damien's carefully constructed revenge, she understood for the first time how incomplete that belief had always been. It did not excuse what he had done. It did not make the fear she had carried for weeks any less real, or the danger to her life any less serious. But it left her with a discomfort she suspected would follow her long after the legal proceedings concluded, a recognition that the line between victim and consequence was rarely as clean as she had once assumed. Federal agents arrived within the hour, alerted through channels Ethan had quietly established days earlier, channels that traced back to contacts from a career he had never fully left behind, no matter how hard he tried. Damien was taken into custody along with the 2 men who had accompanied him, their carefully constructed conspiracy collapsing under the weight of evidence too thorough to challenge. Marcus Reed, stripped of the loyalty payments that had bought his silence, offered a full confession within hours, hoping cooperation might soften whatever consequences awaited him. By morning, the story that had nearly ended in tragedy on the top floor of Hayes Dynamics had become instead a case study in corporate espionage, one that would occupy financial journalists for months, without any of them ever learning the true identity of the man who had stopped it. A month passed before life at Hayes Dynamics began to resemble anything close to normal again. Victoria returned to full operational control of the company, steering it through the inevitable turbulence that followed such a public scandal, with the same steady competence that had built her reputation in the first place. Stock prices, which had wavered dangerously in the days following Damien's arrest, stabilized as investors recognized the strength of leadership that had survived betrayal without losing its composure. Board members who had quietly questioned Victoria's judgment during the crisis now found themselves eager to reaffirm their support, a shift in loyalty that amused her more than it flattered her, given how thin that support had proven when it actually mattered. The press, predictably, wanted answers. Reporters camped outside the building for days, demanding to know the identity of the mysterious figure who had reportedly intervened during the attempted kidnapping, speculation running wild across financial publications about a private security operative Hayes Dynamics had supposedly hired at extraordinary cost. Victoria deflected every question with practiced skill, offering vague statements about internal security protocols that satisfied no one but revealed nothing true. Ethan, for his part, wanted nothing to do with any of it. When two separate journalists managed to track down his name through building records, he declined every interview request with the same quiet firmness he brought to everything else in his life, insisting he was simply an employee who had happened to be in the right place. Nothing more. Nothing worth writing about. He returned to his old routine with a determination that surprised even Victoria, arriving before sunrise, walking the stairwells, fixing the small mechanical failures that kept a building of that size functioning day to day. Some part of him, she suspected, found comfort in that ordinariness, in work that asked nothing more complicated of him than competence and reliability, qualities he had in abundance and had spent years believing were the only things he had left to offer anyone. Yet ordinariness, Victoria noticed, no longer seemed to fit him the way it once had. Employees who used to walk past him without a second glance now lingered a moment longer, some instinct telling them there was more to the quiet man in the gray uniform than his job title suggested. Even if none of them could have said exactly what, he still ate lunch alone in the break room most days, still kept his answers short when coworkers asked about the incident that had briefly turned the building into a crime scene. But the careful invisibility he had cultivated for years had begun, almost imperceptibly, to wear thin at the edges. He caught himself, more than once, glancing toward the executive floor at odd moments during the day, not out of any lingering suspicion but out of something closer to habit, the habit of a man whose attention had finally found something worth paying it to again. But something had shifted in him too, something Victoria noticed in the way he no longer avoided her eyes when they passed each other in the hallway, the way his shoulders no longer carried quite the same weight they had before that morning. She grabbed his wrist and changed both their lives without meaning to. She found him one evening in the basement level, exactly where she had found him the first night she asked him who he used to be, coiling cable with the same unhurried focus, though something in his posture now seemed less like hiding and more like simply being present. She had brought something with her, a small case she set carefully on the workbench beside him. And when he opened it, he found inside it a medal he recognized instantly, one he had left behind years earlier, along with everything else from that old life. A medal Victoria had quietly tracked down through channels even Ethan did not know she possessed. "You saved a lot of people," she told him, her voice softer than the boardroom voice the world usually heard from her. He looked at the medal for a long moment before answering, his jaw tightening slightly around words that had taken him years to admit out loud. "It never feels like enough," he said finally. "Not when you remember the ones you couldn't save." Victoria did not offer him easy reassurance, understanding by now that easy reassurance was not what this particular wound required. Instead, she said something simpler, something that surprised her with its own honesty, even as she spoke it. "Then start by not disappearing from the people you can still help." Ethan looked up at her, and for the first time since she had known him, something in his expression softened completely. The careful distance he kept from everyone around him finally, quietly, giving way. He did not answer with words. He simply set the medal down, closed the case, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, did not turn to walk away. They left the building together that evening, stepping out into a light autumn rain that misted the city streets in a soft gray haze. The kind of weather that made most people hurry toward shelter but seemed, that night, to suit them both perfectly well. She was no longer simply the CEO whose empire he had quietly protected, and he was no longer simply the maintenance manager whose past she had stumbled into by accident. They walked slowly, in no particular hurry to reach anywhere, two people who had each spent years building careful walls around themselves, discovering, almost without meaning to, that those walls had finally found a reason to come down. Somewhere behind them, the glass tower that had nearly become the site of tragedy stood quiet and lit against the darkening sky, indifferent to the two figures crossing the street below, unaware that inside its walls, a story had ended not with headlines or medals, but with something far simpler and far harder to earn. Two people who had learned, against every instinct built by years of loss and caution, to finally trust someone else with the parts of themselves the world was never allowed to see.